Well, thanks, Judy. I'm sort of a mixture of excited and scared to be here because I'm more used to being in a church setting, what got me started on this is that I've always been. I've only just started calling myself a Christian humanist. It's a new label for me, and in fact, this is only about the second time I've used it. It started for me about a year ago, February last year, when I was listening to Radio New Zealand to a recorded program on their spiritual outlook program, and the title was Atheist Spirituality, and the person being interviewed was Bill Cook. And when I listened to this, my sort of eyes just about popped out because I found I agreed with just about everything he said. And here he is speaking on behalf of atheism in this case. And here's me, regular preacher at a couple of Auckland churches. And I've called it, my talk, an apology, confessions of a Christian humanist, because I haven't, the confession bit is that I haven't been as open about it as perhaps I should. I've always been a humanist in the sense that when I was a kid, one of my parents was a regular Christian and my other parent was very sceptical, and I always respected both. So I was open to non-Christian ideas right through my life. And I always had a program in my life of chopping out any bits of Christianity that couldn't pass a rational test. So I would say that I was a rationalist about as soon as I was, probably from when I was about 8 years old. Dropped the idea because when I read about evolution, I thought that explains all the things we used to say that God did, and I still kept the idea of God, but I whittled bits off that didn't pass the test. And the first bits I whittled off were belief in life after death and belief in miracles. And if you chuck those out, I thought, what is left? At that stage of my life, I believed in prayer, so that was left. And I thought, well, I wonder, come 20 years' time, will I believe in that either? And I ended up becoming a Methodist minister, calling myself a secular Christian, and never got into much trouble for that because I was always in liberal churches where I was allowed to question, but never to the point of openly siding with movements that were against the idea of God. So that was a new step. And so you can thank Bill for raising this possibility in my mind. And I'm using the label humanist because that's one of the recognised labels, not one I've used before. As I see it, humanist means somebody who thinks we can cope without divine guidelines. Now, I've always thought that, but I have not often said it in church. So there's so I'm looking for a middle path. I'm not wanting to abandon being a Christian, but I'm wanting to affirm humanist ideas. And so it's a halfway path, trying to have a foot in both camps, if that's possible. It may not be possible, because I know when I had that discussion in Pitt Street Church with Bill, quite a few people enjoyed it, were stimulated by it, but a handful of them were quite hostile to it and said you should not be even mentioning the word atheist, let alone talking to one in church. So the question I want to ask is there a common ground? Is there a middle path between Christianity and humanism? And I think there is. When I haven't used that label before, but when I looked at it, I read a book also that Bill wrote about humanism, history of humanism, and as I see it, I affirm so many of those things that I could label myself a humanist. I don't know whether you would agree with that. In fact, I'm interested in your response to this idea. But I've looked at 5 areas which I think make me a Christian humanist. And the first is the goal of reconciliation. And I would say that if you were to ask me as a liberal Christian of long standing, what would I say would be the key thing that Jesus taught, the key thing that churches have believed in, I would have said it was reconciliation. And I would hang that idea on the peg of a parable of Jesus, of the prodigal son, which probably everybody knows, which is about basically a person who, as I see it, who observed the Jewish religion, another person who didn't, They were the split amongst Jews in his time, and the two groups could not even share a meal together. That's how hostile they were to each other. Jesus mixed with both groups, and he got criticised by one group. They said, "Why do you eat with these sinners?" Their label, not a label anyone would want to use today. But the question was, why was he friendly to people on both sides of the fence? And then he told the story about the two brothers, who one was the strict type and one was the loose type. And father welcomed the young son back to his home, the old son, and threw a party for him. And the old brother wouldn't come to the party. So as I see it, that was a key belief for him, that these two halves of his society, one of whom was strict Jews and one of whom were not, these two parties should be able to have a meal together. And so I would say his goal was reconciliation, not a word he used on that particular occasion, but many of his sayings are about reconciliation. Love your enemies, forgive other people. Many of his teachings fit that pattern. So I'd say, as a Christian, that's one of my main goals. And my own Methodist church would apply that not just to the church, but would apply it to all of society, and would say there are various people in society who are treated like the bad son in the story, and we would say they ought to be welcomed as full members of society. And from when I was studying for the ministry in 1960-ish, the big issue that we were all fighting for was women's lib. We were one of the first churches in New Zealand to have a women minister, so that was a big issue for us for a while, but it was on the spirit of reconciliation, that women have equal rights. Not long after that, we got involved in the campaign against racist tourists from South Africa, and the reason for that was that black people were not being treated as equal. Come on. And so we took the line, black people are equal to white people, therefore we should not be joining in that. And so that became a big cause for us for a number of years. Another big cause was gay rights. And my church and some others were strongly in favour of gay people having full rights. My own church, Pitt Street Methodist Church, had a gay minister up to into the year 2000. Now all these things, I would say, were in the spirit of reconciliation. They all had the theme that everybody in society is equal, everybody has a place, nobody should be shamed for what they are. So now when I say that, you'll obviously make the point that a heck of a lot of Christians didn't support that, and a heck of a lot of people did. But I'm not talking about Christianity as a whole. I'm just saying there was a slice of Christian people then and now who supported this goal, and I'd say it's a goal, it's a humanist goal. I think it is. So to me, anybody who tries to live and tries to work for a society where everybody is welcome, I would say a Christian humanist can do both of those things. A Christian can do that, a humanist can do that. So you can, if you are putting that goal high on your list, you could be a Christian humanist. You wouldn't have to, because many other people do it besides Christians. But I'm just saying that's one of the things, one of the planks that it means. Now, a lot of conservative Christians would not really buy that. They would say, we want everybody to be welcomed in society, but first they have to meet these criteria. First they've got to believe in Jesus, they've got to follow various moral standards. So although they believe in this, they really compromise it, because they say nobody else except Christians can live a moral life, nobody else, but I mean, I'm preaching to convert, I'm sure on this, but it has been a battle, and liberal churches have generally said all people can contribute to moral. Everybody knows the golden rule. There are good people in all communities. Where I first got this idea from, the full sting of it, was from my own Methodist church. The Methodist leader, John Wesley, wrote some sermons which are standard for all Methodist preachers. They've got to say, yes, I can go along with that. And one of them is a sermon against bigotry. And in it, he said, anybody, he shared the belief that only God can make you into a good person. But he said God can do it through absolutely anybody. He said God can work through Anglicans, he can work through Muslims, he can work through Jews, he can work through the term he used was deist. Now, deist is not a term we use that much today, but that was about as close as anybody in those days could get to atheism. These are people who believed in God, but a God who didn't reveal himself. It was basically a God of logic. And he said God can work through these people even though they don't believe in God. Now, I would say he had taken it about as far as he could, in the sense of saying everybody can contribute moral ideas. Anybody of these people can teach you ideas of how to live. And then, so I was quite pleased to find that John Wesley was so open-minded. Of course, he wasn't completely open-minded. I don't think he realised that if God can speak through anybody, then God has done himself out of a job. So I don't think he followed it through. But I think his heart was in the right place. I think he was, to some extent, a humanist, because he acknowledged the ability of all humans to contribute to the moral discussion. And so I thought he was a sort of trailblazer, until I realised that Jesus had done the same thing himself in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is usually taken as a recommendation that people should love their neighbours, and which it is also. But then I realised that he's not actually talking that way. He's actually saying that other people from all different religions and beliefs can show love. They're not just people we should care about. They're people who care about us, who know as much about right and wrong as we do. So I would say that Jesus would have accepted this also. I would put him amongst the humanists on that belief. I'm not suggesting that he was the first. The idea of everybody contributing to ideas of right and wrong. The furthest back example I can find was Socrates, who was in a debate with a friend of his about because he was accused of wrecking people's belief in God. He encouraged young people to challenge their views about God. So that was what he ended up being killed for discouraging belief in the gods. And he had this discussion while he was in jail awaiting sentence, and he said to this person, "What is piety?" And the person said, "I suppose piety is doing what the gods like." And so Socrates said to him, "What if the gods are misbehaving? Does that mean you should do what the gods like then?" And the argument goes round and round in circles. But the guts of it is that humans are the judges of right and wrong. The gods aren't. If you want to believe in God, and I'm not saying you have to, but if you believe in God as the Greeks did, then it's for you to say whether a god's behaviour is good or not. And so I'd say Socrates was probably the first person. There may be others before him. He's the first person I read of who announced that idea. And of course, what he said about the Greek gods would equally apply to the human gods. That if we believe in gods, and I know probably most of you don't, but if we believe in gods, then we're the ones who should be saying whether the gods are behaving well. There's a Jewish story that I quite like. It's a horrible story, really, but it's about God is on his way to destroy the people. This is a horrendous story, and I don't believe a word of it. But God was on his way to check out reports that the people of Sodom were misbehaving. And God said, God called on his friend Abraham on the way, and God said, I better tell Abraham what I'm up to. And so Abraham said to him, well, what are you going to do if you find that not all of the people in Sodom are bad? Are you going to destroy the whole city? Say you were short of 100 people. There's 100 people there, good people, and the other whatever they were bad people. Would you destroy the whole lot? And so God said to him, no, if I find 50 people there who are good people, I'll let the rest off. And so Abraham said, what if they're 5 short of the 50? And the discussion goes like this. And while it's a horrible story, it makes the point that Abraham was actually putting God on the spot. He was challenging God. He was the one who had the moral standards. And God, in his turn, didn't pass the moral standard for going to want to destroy a whole city. So there's several stories in the Bible that are like that, where God actually is put on the spot by human beings. So I would accept that all humans can contribute to moral guidelines. I was very surprised to read a recent case of an atheist who didn't agree with that. And this was Stephen Jay Gould. You may have read of him. He was a famous commentator on evolution and died just a couple of years ago. And he was on a panel at the Vatican where they were discussing evolution. He was very pleased to find that the Catholics believed in evolution, and he came up with the idea that scientists should never contribute to ethical discussions. He called it NOMA, N-O-M-A, and he was using Catholic language. The Catholics have got the idea that there's a magisterium, a teaching authority that the church has, and the church can teach moral issues, but scientists should keep out of them. And Stephen Jay Gould came up with the idea of non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, science is for the scientists, morals are for the moralists, and the two should never have conversations with each other. And have you heard of this guy and that idea? Yes. When I first, and he, I might say, was an atheist. So I thought, something wrong with this. And I've since read a lot of other commentators who would equally say it's way wrong. The best of these commentators, in my view, was Sam Harris, who wrote a book about 2 years ago, The Moral Landscape. And the whole theme of his book is that scientists can and should comment on moral issues. And the reason he gave was that moral issues are based on what is good for human beings. And you can tell what's good for human beings by studying their brain, and he himself, I think, was a neurologist. So he hadn't by any means finished the program. He just said, in theory, you should be able to base all moral issues on science of how does the human brain respond, what makes humans suffer, what makes them happy, what makes them care about other people. Now, I must say I couldn't agree more. I'd say that, and so that goes flat against Stephen Jay Gould. He's saying, Stephen Jay Gould is saying the two should keep apart, and Harris is saying science should be able to comment on absolutely everything. And I'd say that's a bottom line belief for me as well. So anybody, and I would not only say scientists, so that's my one reservation, the thought that some scientists might come up and say, okay, we've studied the human brain, now this is what you've got to do. I would sort of be a bit reluctant to say that scientists only, but I would agree with him that science and anybody else has a part in the discussion of right and wrong. Now, my third theme is one that I got from another atheist, Christopher Hitchens, who died around about Christmas. And I read his book, what's it called? God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Now, when I read this, I was sort of, my first reaction was, he is way overreacting. Because he has have you read this book? Have any read? Yes. It's it's probably the most brutal attack I've ever read on religion. It's not only against Christianity, but it's against even non-theistic forms of religion like Buddhism. But yet I thought, well, I've read other books that sort of slate Christianity and point out all the evil things that Christians do, and I thought, well, sure, some Christians do this, we don't all do it. But Hitchens went a notch further and basically said all religion is evil. And in trying to get my head around that, one of the websites I like reading for comments on this sort of issue is Richard Dawkins' website. And on that site, I came to realise that there were hundreds, perhaps even a majority of the contributors to his site, who obviously would agree with Hitchens on that, and in some cases it's through personal experience that they have been victims of bigotry, and it made me appreciate that even liberal Christians like myself have actually unintentionally encouraged it by simply not drawing the line at it. But our people in our own churches have bigoted ideas, and we've not stood up against it. We've never stood up and been counted and said that's a dangerous idea. And I came to, I would say, 80% agree with him, with Hitchens, when I read how some people have been and are still being pressured by religious groups to do things, told things are right when they're not right, given Bible stories as though they are infallible. And I came to think, what is it that makes religion have these poisonous effects? And I came to see that I myself was contributing to some extent, because every time I take a sermon, I just about always have a Bible text, and I end up by saying, this is what the Bible says, and I try and find some good thing in it, and maybe some bad things in it as well, and I don't deal with those. So I didn't bring the Bible along today. I brought Richard Dawkins' book, The Magic of Reality. But I guess the two things that I'd say that I would agree are bad about religion, one would be that it does encourage bigotry, because if you believe that God is on your side and that God has inspired your leaders and your leaders are infallible, those are bigoted ideas. So however nice and gentle you are about it, if you really believe that you have a hotline to God, then that is going to make you bigoted. And even if you're like John Wesley, who was not very bigoted, who said, he still would give, despite the fact he's open to ideas from atheists, he still thinks those good ideas come from God. So he's, for all his attempting to be open-minded, there is a sort of built-in bias to the idea of God, because it really says there is one source of morality and I've got it and you haven't. So anybody who starts with that premise is going to get off on some wrong point. And the other thing, obviously, is that it automatically tends to superstition. If you read a story from the Bible, just about every story in the Bible implies that there is some supernatural being, and if you're on side with him, things are going to go well, things are going to be specially arranged for you. And so I would have to agree that anybody who takes the idea of God literally has got an idea in their heads that I've got the answer and you haven't, and they've got the idea that there's magic going on and I can tap into it. And both of those ideas are going to get you into serious trouble if you take them literally. Now, my only defence is that I don't take them literally, and hopefully can avoid that damage. Today, this very day, I was preaching at Pitt Street Church about the story of Noah's Ark, and I ended up, and this is why I got the Richard Dawkins book, because he's got a nice chapter about Noah's Ark in it, and he compares the Noah's Ark story with the Babylonian story about it, and he also says that Noah's Ark, part of the story is that God agrees never to destroy the earth again, and that he will, it explains that there was a rainbow that God put in the sky. It was a promise he was never going to destroy the earth again. Well, in talking about that, I felt like a humanist. I felt like I was trying to extract some value from the story. At the same time, I had to say how terribly negative it was. One negative thing was the assumption the story had some divine authority because it's in the Bible. So I used Richard Dawkins to deal with that issue. He tells the story of the very, very similar story to Noah's Ark that was held by the Babylonians at the time. And I was taught in theological college and still believe the Babylonian story was written first, and it's very, very similar. And the Jewish people copied it but rewrote it in bits. And when you look at the two stories, they are so similar. It's obvious that one's copying the other. But the Jewish one is actually nastier than the other one. In the Babylonian story, one of the gods says, let's go and destroy the human race. They're making so much noise they keep us awake at night. and the other gods said, don't be so mean. And one of them goes and tells their hero, who was not Noah, I forget his name, build yourself a boat and we'll save you from this disaster. And after the flood comes over, they say to this god who caused the flood, you can't come to this party. You are so unfair. What you did was unjust. Now, I just had to admit that the Babylonian story is not as bad as the Jewish story. They've got a bunch of gods, of whom one's a villain and another god who tries to save you. But anyway, my response to that issue of is the idea of God evil was to present the kids with these two stories and say, these are just stories, which do you prefer? And in other words, to try and encourage their own moral judgment and see that they are just stories. So these two stories are science fiction. They are trying to create they are trying to understand floods, trying to say why would the gods cause a flood, and they're making up a story about it. I said, but it's just science fiction. Make up your own minds. And with the adults, I took it further and said, A, the story is not true. B, if a God did that, he would be an unjust God. C, there have been major disasters in the past which have exterminated life on a grand scale. The death of the dinosaurs was one of half a dozen of them. It could happen again, so the Bible promise it will never happen again. It could happen again. It is happening again because we are destroying the environment. So I mean, so I treated this is my approach as a Christian humanist. I'm extracting value from the book. I say it has started a worthwhile discussion. It was intelligent comment on its own time, but we need to take it in a different direction. So I would say that is true of all the Bible stories about God. They are all basically fiction. Some of them are creative fiction. Some people treat the parable of the prodigal son as a story about God, and they'd say God loves all people. Well, I'd say that's a creative bit of fiction. I'd say the Noah story is a bad bit of fiction. But when it comes to the point, do we need these fictions? And I would say that many Christians today would say these stories are out wearing their welcome. We can turn them to good use if we use critical judgment on them. But to take these stories as literally true, you're going to be forever explaining them away. And here I value another saying from John Wesley. He believed in some of the maddest religious ideas. One of them was that you could cast lots to decide whether something was God's will or not. So he used to do this from time to time. And he preached a sermon about it. And he says, this idea should not be overdone. He says, you shouldn't be consulting God on everything that happens. God gave you your own common sense. Use that most of the time. So I'd say, if you take his idea and take it one notch further, you'd say God gave you common sense. Forget all these stories. So I would, and I'd say many other liberal Christians do the same in the sense that they reduce the amount of time they talk religion. When they get together, are not trying to convert other people to Christianity. They do listen to other viewpoints. So although these ideas are still valued, because there are still some good discussion starters, some good celebrations written into them, but if you take them literally, I'd agree with Sam Harris. If you take all these stories as literal truth, I would agree with them, they're poison. But I still hope, as a Christian, I can help people extract the good bits from the poison. Where am I up to? The fourth point is the one that I was aware of as a child. I was aware that I had pretty well thrown out, I'd secularised religion to the point where God almost no longer existed when I was about 8 years old. But I still valued prayer. And for me, that was the crunch issue. When I even became an atheist when I was about 20 years ago, but I backed away from it slowly without noticing. But I still valued prayer. And so, and I've had liberal Christian people who said to me, we have trouble with the idea of prayer. We don't, it does not mean anything to us. And I was in a spot because I said, well, I find it very helpful. So I was studying psychology over the last 10 years, and I was sort of surprised to find that I didn't literally believe in a religious interpretation of prayer myself, and that many people, when they pray, I remember noticing this when I was about 12 years old. I thought my minister was an atheist, because whenever he prays, he never actually expects God to do anything. He always says, God help me do this, God help me do that, God help me do the other thing. But actually he's always doing it himself. And I realised that I was doing the same. In fact, I would think if you go to a church today, even quite a conservative church, you'll find that they actually expect very little to happen as a result of their prayers. This is even conservative churches. I was in a conservative church for a number of years, and I only found one prayer that the preacher was actually asking for a miracle. This was when a member of the congregation was dying of cancer, and he said, God, we hope that he'll get better, and he'll get better in a way that will surprise even the doctors. And I was like, he's wanting a miracle. And the guy died the next day. Yeah. But another case, though, but I quote him to say he's rare, because another case, I remember a member of the congregation was also dying, And members of our church decided to hold prayer meetings for her, and they did. And the minister said to me, who was a Liberal person too, he says, I wonder if I should warn them not to pray for this person to get better, because that would be superstitious. And I said, I don't think it would do them any harm to pray that if that's what they believe. But as it turned out, and none of them did. Nobody prayed for this woman to get better. They were all praying prayers of support. I hope our friends will support her. They were prayers of support. Nobody asked for magic. And that included some very conservative people. But they saw prayer as moral support, not as magic. So I would say that although if you take the idea of God at face value, we should be asking God to do all sorts of magical things. But in fact, it doesn't happen that much. And so I came to the conclusion that my own prayers that I was still doing were really a kind of psychology. Because when I pray, I never ask for magic. I never ask God to make up my mind for me. I just say, I'm worried about this, I'm concerned about this, I wonder what I should do. I'm basically trying to sort my own thinking out. And in studying psychology, which I did for a number of years part-time, psychologists, one of the techniques they use is to ask someone to write a letter. Like particularly if they've got some ideas that are very hard to express. They may have been abused as a child. And the psychologist would say, well, write a letter to your father who abused you. And they'd say, I couldn't write it. He will be shocked if he read this. And he said, don't send it to him, just write it. And they would write it and it would help. And the reason it would help was because they're difficult feelings to deal with. And I thought, that is what I'm doing when I'm praying. I'm not actually asking for help. I'm expressing things that are hard to express to anybody else. And so although I'm sort of believing in a God, he is a God who does nothing but listen. That's all he's doing. I'm not asking him to do anything else. And I still do it, and I still find it helpful. But if somebody ever said to me, well, prayer is a load of rubbish, the Methodist Church doesn't want them anymore, it would not worry me one bit, because I would find other ways of doing it. Because it's not magic for me, I wouldn't miss it if it went. But since we do it, I do it, and I write prayers, and I try to make them that kind of prayer that help people express how they feel. So those are my 4 main points, and the 5th one is the value of dialogue. I think if Christians and atheists and humanists discuss things together, there would be benefits. Even I don't see them as being opposites. And one benefit emerged when Bill spoke at the Pitt Street Church. And one of the readings he'd had from Bertrand Russell, I was very surprised to find that several people absolutely loved this reading. It was a reading about death, and it was, I can't remember the detail, but it was saying when your life comes, it's like the river going out into the sea, and the satisfaction you should feel is that the things that you have been caring about and working for will be carried on and picked up by other people. Now, several Christians loved that as a funeral. It was introduced as a funeral meditation. It's part of Bill's atheist spirituality. Now, there's 2 or 3 Methodists who want to use that when they're at their funerals, you know. And that's because they are liberal Christians. They've scrubbed the idea of life after death, so your traditional stuff goes over their heads, but it still picks up their feelings. So that's the kind of thing that could happen. I would hope that some atheists who are into atheist spirituality would publish a book on them, of these sayings, and advertise it in the church newspapers, because they would sell. Another bit of dialogue, I would think, would be the promotion of science. I believe in promoting science. So do most liberal Christians who believe in the theory of evolution. If liberal Christians and people like Dawkins got together on the same side of the fence instead of opposite sides, I think they would help promote science better. And not because the liberal Christians could teach any science to someone like Dawkins, but they would deal with questions that he doesn't deal with. Just because they are mixing in religious circles, they would see issues he doesn't deal with. The first Dawkins book I read and I liked was The Blind Watchmaker, which is about evolution, written in very popular style, but it didn't deal with any of the issues that I have discussed with the Christians. It didn't deal with the origin of species. It was all about natural selection, and it explained that quite well. It didn't deal with the origin of the human race. It didn't deal with what makes humans distinct from animals. it didn't deal with the origin of language, which many people would say is what makes us distinct. In other words, these are all key issues to Christians who believe in God, because they'd say these make us human, we're made in the image of God and so on. He didn't deal with them. Now, why didn't he deal with them? Because he's mainly firing his guns at conservative Christians who believe every word of the Bible, and he was attacking their issues, not these issues of middle-of-the-road Christians who believe in evolution but can't fit it in with their idea of God. So I think if liberal Christians and atheists got together, they could make some valuable contributions there. That's enough, I think. One other point I was going to say, but I'd rather leave a bit of time for you to comment and ask questions.
David, I appreciate that you've gone on a journey of scepticism, and you've been influenced by evolution in the process of that journey. What I can't quite understand is how evolution explains explains the actual origin of life, the beginning of living creatures as opposed to inorganic substances. Now, I don't think that I accept that evolution is a framework for biological study these days, and I'm not questioning that. But what I'm saying is, how did you determine that evolution dispenses with the idea of a creator of life?
I'd agree that the evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. It explains how one life form evolves to another. And Richard Dawkins would agree with you. He says it's an issue for chemists to say that there was some self-reproducing cell. The first self-reproducing cell obviously didn't arrive from evolution. He said it would be not probably DNA, which is the main reproducer now. It probably was more like RNA. But he would agree he doesn't know. And in one of his books, I can't remember which, he said it could have happened by molecules adhering to wet clay in the early earth and forming by chance some self-reproducing molecule which then would evolve. In other words, evolution explains the story of life except for step one. And I think, I'm not saying anything heretical. I think Dawkins would agree with that. And step one still hasn't been solved.
Can I just comment on that and say that I think that step one would have been a unique one-off, a transition from inorganic change to living things which change in a more programmed way.
So it's a matter of faith. You kind of either accept that first step, and then the rest of evolution sort of follows on through the fossil record and so on.
No, I would accept it.
Well, no, that's not actually true. Whilst the details are still being worked out, evolution does explain, in fact, basically how. I mean, it's already been done in the laboratory that amino acids, which is the basis of life, have been reproduced. So, sure, the details are still very, very sketchy, and they're working on that, but it does explain the origin of life in a very broad sense anyway. So it's not true to say that it's I think when you're coming from the old God of the gaps argument, which is there's a gap, and so
I don't think I am.
Put God in there, which of course is
I'm saying that
really gets you nowhere.
I'm saying, how does evolution dispense with the idea of a creative force? Because, and now what you're saying is that the science has discovered a way of doing that. I haven't seen that established scientifically.
Well,
so what I think is that you take a step of faith, that life happens somehow and then developed in the evolutionary pattern.
I think we're talking about three different things. I think what you're talking about of the amino acids, there was an experiment by Urey and somebody else who fired electricity into a chemical soup, more or less, and it produced amino acids. But those were not self-reproducing. Amino acids are the building blocks of life. They don't reproduce. That could have been
moved on, and there is a cell now that can reproduce itself.
We've moved on since then. Science has moved on since then. They have a cell that reproduces.
There is a point actually that about all this, and this is there are probably about 500 points I could make, but I'll confine it to one.
Yeah.
Is that what we often forget in this discussion is that if you come back to the fundamentals of how religion started and how it was created in the first place, that all of these kinds of, albeit very interesting discussions about, evolution, we've explained evolution in that sense, and it doesn't explain the origin of life. If we look at the basis of religion actually it doesn't say in the Bible that amino acids produce first and that natural selection. It doesn't say that. Religion itself comes from a time when we understood nothing about science, and people often forget this and and a lot of people who are still trying to justify religious belief. And I'm not saying you're in this camp, obviously not, but people who try to justify religious belief will go back and say, well, yes, we can't believe in the God of the Bible anymore, but there's still a room for this creator. Now, to me, you've created another God. That's not the God that most people believe in, that most people talk about. So it doesn't actually, you know what I'm saying, it doesn't actually relate to the God that they're originally talking about. It's the God of the gaps argument once again, that the God of the Bible is essentially non-existent.
Yeah.
You take you half an hour to learn that that's the case. Yeah. That God doesn't exist and cannot exist. But the God that they talk about is then that they replace that with something else. Oh yes, but what if? And I've just been reading a book by Victor Stenger, which is all about the fine-tuning argument, which is another story. But the whole thing comes down to this argument about they're inventing all these other gods. If you know what I mean.
Yep. The fine-tuning. Are you talking about the anthropic principle?
Which is it actually comes down to the people who argue for fine-tuning don't understand the science behind it. I've come from a science background, so they don't actually understand the science behind it, and use all these arguments. But again, they're arguing about a different God. They're not arguing about the God of the Bible or the God of the Quran or whatever. They've invented another God. And that's often the point that even the people who've mentioned, Dawkins and Hitchens and all these other guys who I have great admiration for, often miss that they've invented this other God, and we're now arguing about some other God that they've invented.
Yeah, I'd agree with you to the point that there are lots of different stages in the arrival of life that we know now, and different people see God in different parts of the line. But I would say they're basically all wrong in the sense that there was no big intervention. It happened by natural processes, but some of the natural processes are still not fully explained. But I still think it's going to come down to a natural process explanation.
Yes.
But there still are gaps, I'd say, in the story.
Oh, absolutely.
I guess I'm curious. Excellent speech, by the way. I think touches on many issues. As far as I can see, you're a humanist. I don't quite see how you're a Christian humanist.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've dispensed with the supernatural aspects of it, I guess I'm left wondering if God isn't interacting with the world and it isn't, like you say, doesn't answer prayers, that all these other stories are not true, then in what sense are you, and presumably, I guess the question is, do you believe in the divinity of Christ, for example?
No.
So that was my guess. So in what sense are you a Christian? Are you not just a humanist?
Well, I'm not a Christian in the sense of believing the lot, but I'm a Christian in the sense of believing some large chunks of it. So I'd say that's totally Christian. That's totally Christian.
So you believe in the values of
I don't really go very far down that road, except that I say I can buy it as poetry. I like the story of Noah's Ark. I think it was part of a creative bit of discussion going on by people who hadn't done any science, but still asked intelligent questions that are worth asking today. So I'm saying this bit of religion, I can go with it as discussion starter. I could say the people who wrote Noah's Ark, I would enjoy sitting around a table with them, because I'm trying to do the same stuff as they are, saying what's the purpose of natural disasters. So I mean, I'm joining in on their discussion, but I'm certainly not agreeing with the final outcome they take it to. But today in church I was spending 20 minutes talking about Noah's Ark without shocking anybody, because I was just using it as an agenda. I was saying the answers it gives, two of the answers are wrong, but the questions were valid and worth facing. So but I'm certainly not a Christian. I once did a summary and I said I'm a 58% Christian. I did that on the basis of looking at all the sermons I've written the last 3 years, and I found that 58% of them were agreeing with the Bible and 42 weren't. So I'm not agreeing with a lot. So if for Christians who think you've got to believe the lot, then I'm not a Christian at all. But I never did think you had to believe the lot.
Okay, so I mean, I guess the question is, I mean, there's a lot of Christian Catholics, for example, have a certain creed. They have certain things that you must believe in order to be able to identify yourself as, well, at least a Catholic. And a lot of, I guess, the message I'm getting is that you believe in a lot of the values that, say, Christ propounded or is reputing to have, love, compassion, tolerance, all the things that we commonly associate with that.
Yeah.
That we also, like the humanist, atheist humanist organisations also believe in these things.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, since we agree on so much, is there actually any disagreement? What is the difference between yourself and our position?
None at all. None at all between me and a humanist, an open-minded humanist who would not totally rubbish Christianity but would say I disagree. A tolerant humanist I would be totally agreeing with, and a tolerant Christian I would be totally agreeing with. It's only a slice, but I'm only accepting a slice of Christianity. I'm not accepting the lot, and so there are some Christians who'd throw me out because I don't accept the lot. But my best answer is 58%. I go with 58% and I disagree with the rest.
Thank you.
Maybe should give us a definition of what you think is a humanist, because I think that's quite the term humanist is not very clear, and for a lot of people very confusing what a humanist is. So maybe you can give us first your.
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I didn't even start studying the issue till about a year ago.
Right.
But I would say a humanist is somebody who believes that you can run your life without divine help. I think that's probably. I'm guessing that this would be probably one of the defining ideas of it. I don't know. That's the one I'm pegging myself to when I say I'm a humanist. And I would say that Jesus was a humanist in that sense, that a lot of his parables make sense whether you believe in God or not. So, but he wasn't a humanist, but he provides a basis for me to be a humanist by teaching things like the Good Samaritan, like the prodigal son, that you don't have to believe in God to do those things.
Okay, well, I come from quite a humanist sort of background, and I would call myself more an atheist these days, partly because I feel it's too confusing. I think sort of calling yourself a Christian humanist is almost calling yourself a Christian atheist. I mean, those two things are almost opposite. And sort of my sort of learning of humanist is more it's seeing what the human experience, what comes from a human experience. That's sort of what you take in as part of your belief system, as you could call it that. Like so. Things that are out of your human vision or experience, you're not accepting that as your belief system, basically. So if you're saying, okay, I can be a religious humanist, that's two things that are completely opposite. I don't know how you would justify that.
I would, if people said I was an atheist, I would not say they're wrong. But to me, the emphasis is different. Because I do value religious traditions, I do value prayer. Even though I give them a secular interpretation, I still value them. So that's why I would not want to say I'm an atheist, because then I'd be attacking prayer at the very same time next minute might be leading a prayer. So, but I'm not taking it at its face value. So it's a watered down concept of God that I'm using. So that's why, but it still is, I still value some of the ideas of God, but God still is a fictional character to me but he's a fiction that I value. The father of the prodigal son is a leader I would like to follow, even though he's not a real person.
Yeah, I strongly think you wouldn't find many humanists that would accept Christianity as being acceptable in their philosophy.
I think what you're getting at is that, and the authors you mentioned talk about this a lot, is that what we would generally regard as humanist ideals are actually part of our evolution as we evolved. So religion borrowed humanist ideals, not the other way around. So the fact that people are attached to religion and say, well, it has all these moral ideas, it has some moral ideas, that's true, but the moral ideas were actually taken from humanists, or just in the general term, that humanist ideas in the beginning. So there may be a reluctance to reject the idea of the origin of this being a religious origin, in actual fact origin. The origin is actually humanist in the beginning, and religion simply borrowed those things. I think that's what it's trying
is that what you're saying?
Kind of get at, or would that be a... No? Not really?
No, it's not too... Yeah,
I personally don't think it matters where they come from. I don't think it, I mean, say you take the idea of the golden rule. Now, Christians would accept it, atheists would accept it. So I would say it's common ground. Now, who was the first person to think the golden rule was? Now, I don't actually know, and I don't actually matter. I don't think it matters.
Confucius.
Was it?
Confucius, yeah.
Okay. No, I don't know. Was he? I think Confucius was a humanist, wasn't he? I'm not sure. But anyway, to my mind, it doesn't. The point is, it doesn't matter if there's a good idea around. It doesn't matter who had it first.
Sure. In that sense, yeah, but what I'm saying is you're dressing it up in, it's kind of like religion is claiming, is claiming that these humanist values are theirs. And
I'm sorry, I certainly would not. I would not claim that. No.
I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm speaking generally that religious groups would claim that these moral issues, these moral precepts, if you like, were invented by them. Yeah. But in reality, they weren't. They were borrowed by them, and that in fact, these predate the modern religion.
I mean, there's a continuity problem. I mean, obviously, humanism is a relatively modern term. I mean, the Christians obviously got their moral basis from the previous Jewish, and the Jewish supposedly got their moral standards actually from the Egyptians. So if you take it right back, I think there's been a continuity and evolution of morals over time. Yeah. If you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for example, they have a much more extensive range of moral injunctions, essentially covering a broader range of behaviours than, say, in the Bible with the Ten Commandments. They include many of the same, for example, prohibitions on homosexuality, which we wouldn't agree with today. But I think it's clear that things like non-violence, many of the ideas that we have today, and sort of in the secular, where we would agree, we all agree that these things are good. They originated from the Egyptian and sort of the Middle Eastern cultures there originally. They don't necessarily happen in other cultures. Like South American cultures had, cannibalism and some horrendous things according to our culture.
Well, I'd agree that religion borrowed many ideas. I don't know about the Egyptian case, but I've read a bit about the Babylonian case. I know a lot of the commandments of Moses were based on commandments of Hammurabi. So I agree with you. They've been borrowed from all over. But on the other hand, I think I don't know whether Hammurabi's ideas were religious or not. But I agree there's been borrowing right, left, and centre. And I come back to what I said before. I don't think it greatly matters who started a particular idea.
I guess it matters only in the sense that in the modern world, Christians, one of the things I guess that sort of binds us here today is the fact that there's charges that if you are not a Christian, then you are somehow immoral. And there's something bad about you, something wrong about you, because you don't accept the divinity of Christ, for example. Yeah. Which oddly, as you said, you don't accept the divinity of Christ in that way. So that doesn't make you a bad person, because there's been a long tradition of many different cultures that have incorporated these same values. They're not specifically Christian. They're not specifically.
I'm sorry if I gave that impression. I would. I was.
No, you're not.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
you're not.
Yeah.
This is, I guess, I guess if there's hostility from the atheist atheist community to the Christian, it's really a reflection of the way, in many ways, we're perhaps not demonized, but there's this perception that because we're atheists, we don't share that common moral foundation, which isn't true.
Yeah.
Could I just make a point here? I'm finding this a bit hard to say. I am a Christian, and I don't apologise for that. I believe in the divinity of Christ, and I believe in the spiritual values. Christ, with his Father, he said things in relation to God, which I believe in. But you're saying that Christians say that you're wrong. Now, I would never say that as a Christian. I would respect your belief, and I think respect is the key. Okay, I believe in the divinity of Christ. I expect that you will somehow respect the fact that I've come to that belief through my own process, but it's a valid process. You have come to a different belief. I respect that. I don't demonise you. I would hope that other Christians wouldn't demonize.
The majority do.
I'll address that. Well, I don't think I think a majority that come knocking on my door demonise me. Hang on, yeah, okay. A majority of the Christians I know do not do that. We're talking about most of my family are Christians. People I work with have never done that. However, there is a rather pervasive presence, say, from the internet, and certainly in the Bible Belt, where Christians have, and in Wanganui as it happens, where there's an expectation that if you, or a perception, that if you're not Christian, you're somehow, different and potentially excluded. Yeah. So I mean, this isn't a, and I think there's a
psychology of this, though, isn't it? This is a psychology that happens. That what I believe has to be right, and people will call each other wrong because they believe that what they think is right. So the psychology here, not religion so much. You're dealing with people who feel the difference between themselves and you, and it comes out in a judgmental way. But that's not necessarily a feature of their Christian religion. It's a feature of their personal emotional makeup, that they're treating you like that way. So you've got to be big enough to kind of see the what's actually happening in the process.
There's a deeper issue here, and the issue is that the first commandment of the 10 Commandments is "Thou shalt not have any other god before you." In other words, there's an injunction on Christians to not believe in any other religion and not tolerate it.
Oh, okay. Well, but where does that come into this discussion?
Well, what I'm saying is that the very first commandment of the very core of Christianity is to be intolerant, and I'm not saying
that's not logical, I'm afraid. The commandments came to Moses, and they were guidelines, but if you believe in a God, there's got to be that exclusivity about it. There's got to be exclusivity. If God is God, he's a very big God, and he created the whole universe. You don't believe in anyone else. You've got to have that exclusivity. So it's not intolerance. It's just a feature of the concept of a divine creator.
Can we hear from the speaker, please?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I would agree with you basically that the first commandment, only love God, is an intolerant commandment, and it's one of these things I'd say here, that religion taken at its face value is misleading. At its face value, that says you should not tolerate anyone else, and so I'd agree. Not all Christians go with that. Not all Christians buy that intolerance. But the idea of God has almost an invitation in it to be intolerant, and I feel those of us who go to church really have to fight against it. We have to say, and I regularly do, this is in the Bible, but it's not true. And I think unless we do that, the weight of the idea of God is going to drag people into intolerance. But so I'd agree with Hitchens that religion, taken whole and as its face value, is poison. But I'd say not all Christians swallow the poison. Some of us try and get the good bits and dilute the poison somehow.
Can I just address the Hitchens' book? When he's talking about religion as poison, he doesn't necessarily, I just want to clarify something, it doesn't mean that all people who believe in religious things are poisonous. Okay? So, I mean, it's not an attack against people who believe things. And I think most people here, certainly myself, believe in freedom of religion. Right? So even though I'm personally an atheist, I don't, we're talking about respect before, I respect people of religion, I don't judge them, I don't call them idiots or behave in any other reprehensible way. So I mean, there is that acceptance and respect for both sides. I don't agree with their position necessarily, but that doesn't mean that I treat them badly or any differently. And I think Hitchens believed this as well, but he also believed that, going back to the Ten Commandments, that there are things in the Bible which people do take literally, and because they're in the Bible, they think they're given permission to do reprehensible things.
Yeah, like the Quran as well.
I think also one of the problems is that so many of the rules and things in the Bible are injunctions against doing things. There are very few things that say where God says, be happy, enjoy yourself. They're all things that restrict happiness and enjoyment and freedom as well.
Some pretty negative stuff there,
Yep.
I say this with the greatest of respect. When I first saw you were coming to speak and I see that you call yourself a Christian humanist, I thought back to the early days of me becoming originally a rationalist, and now I call myself a humanist. And I thought what people in my day back then used to say, here's a man who has a quit each way. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that, but I've heard you speak, and I think you're a very concerned person. But I think you're doing something, and please, you haven't offended me. I don't think you've offended anybody here today. But I think you're doing a sort of a thing which in a way suggests that if a person is just a straight out humanist, you couldn't be that. You still have to hang on to that Christian side of yourself. I think, sir, and I say this with the greatest of respect because you are an intelligent man, I can tell by the way you talk, but I think you're at war with yourself as much as you are with anything else. And you know, I'm not going to bore everybody here by talking about what I do, but one of the things that I do, apart from being a celebrant, is I give lectures to trainee nurses. I've done it now, this will be my 8th year, and I was approached to do that by a minister, actually, a chaplain at one of the technical institutes. As a result of that, I've stood on a stage, if you like, with people from about 7 or 8 different beliefs, and we all get an opportunity to talk to these nurses, not to preach to them about what we believe so much as telling them that there is difference in the world, and that because a person is different, it doesn't mean that they should be treated as inferior or anything else. Hospitals were one of the worst places in the world at one stage where you could get discrimination, because if you weren't a Christian, you were sort of an oddball. But one of the things that's come from this is that we don't get that much of an opportunity. We don't have soapboxes, we don't have things where we stand on street corners and tell people what it is to be a humanist. This gentleman here is a bit worried about what a humanist is. I just tell you, sir, if you don't already know, we've got a wonderful library downstairs and we've got some very good books, and I can promise you, you'll have your questions answered. But my opportunity has been to get feedback from these girls and men, of course, because it's about 50-50 now. And the thing is, when I've had my say, they say, we never knew that there were people who had a sort of viewpoint with integrity, but they weren't religious. I've taken funerals, and I've had people come up to me and say afterwards, I never knew you could have a meaningful funeral ceremony without religion. And I said, well, you can, and I've just done it. But it seems that there's this business that if you haven't got a belief thing, still it pervades through our society. If you don't believe in God, you are an inferior being. Well, I thought for many years in my life, and this is the confessions of a dyed-in-the-wool humanist now, but I promise you, there were times that I felt inferior. And one of the main reasons why I felt inferior was that I was brought up by a father who was a free thinker and a mother who was a devout Catholic. And they were forever at each other's throats. And I was in the middle, but I suffered from what my mother did to me. And I'm 76 years of age, and I can still remember the fear that I had, right? And I don't ever want that for any child, but there are still children having it done.
Yes, thousands.
What we have to do, and what we try to do, is present that there are responsible human beings in the world. I tell these nurses, I said, it might seem a frivolous thing to say. Sorry, I've got laryngitis at the moment, so I'm not talking that well. Thank goodness, some people say. But I say it's not a frivolous thing, but it's a little bit like, at the end of the day, what colour tie you choose to wear. The big thing is that you don't take the tie off and strangle somebody with it. Now that's basically it. It doesn't, you know, it's not what you believe as much as what you do with what you believe. If people could see that, I've got nothing against people who are devout Christians. I've had some friends, I still have some friends. Everybody in this room has friends. We all have a right to believe what we want. But unless one day we sit down and say, it's time we stop throwing crap at each other and got down to the real things that are mattering in this world right now, we won't have a world to worry about. That's all.